Welcome back, everyone. Welcome. I hope you had a good break, and for those who went outside, that you're not too cold. But welcome back. It's great to be resuming Adventive America with our second panel of three. My name's Catherine Sievett. I'm the Meyerson Professor and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Weitzman School of Design. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this second panel, which we call Empire, Professor Jared Farmer. Jared Farmer is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Penn. Farmer's temporal experience is the long 19th century. His regional expertise is the North American West. His recent work has turned to global environmental history across the modern period. He's the author of 5 books, including Elder Flora, A Modern History of Ancient Trees, which won the Jacques Barzun Prize in Cultural History from the American Philosophical Society. Welcome, Jared. We're excited to get started on this next panel of Empire. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, all of you, for coming on this cold day to this wonderful room. Philadelphia likes to call itself the city of first. You don't know that, right? Being the original capital of the Republic, and if you fudge your ahistorical terminology, home of America's first university, which is Penn, right? And America's first botanical garden, which may or may not be Parchment's Garden. That being said, Philadelphia has rarely figured into horticultural history of 19th century America, but it could, as this conference and this panel demonstrates. Our 3 panelists will give us new ways to think about Philadelphians and introduce plants, not just in national context, but indigenous, global, and imperial context. Before I introduce our 3 experts, I thought I'd give you just a little more local context, because I'm a historian and I just can't help myself. It was in 1897 that Penn created a Department of Botany, the same year I organized my Department of History, which tells you something about the priorities of the 19th century, which are quite different than the priorities today. In addition to having teaching and research functions, the Department of Botany hosted weekly meetings of the Botanical Society of the University of Pennsylvania, which itself was part of the Council of Allied Botanical Societies of Philadelphia. Members of such societies gathered to hear talks and also to visit greenhouse collections at Philadelphia and the Main Line, as this was the Gilded Age's greenhouse craze, with its attendant fad for palms and other tropical flora. The university built its own palm house next to its new botanical garden, overseen by botany professor John McFarland. Evidently, Penn had, for a time, a world-class collection of so-called sensitive plants, like mimosas. Today's Caskey Park, I don't know if you grad students have found this, little tiny green space with a pond surrounded by lab buildings, is the vestige of that botanical garden. The Department of Botany ceased to exist in 1957, and Morris Arboretum, which the university acquired in 1932, was never fully integrated into the academic side of campus, at least not yet, I hope. That can happen in the future, despite the fact that they have an herbarium, a very good herbarium. The Academy of Sciences, as you know, if you were here this morning, has its own large herbarium, and back in the day hosted meetings of botanical societies too. So for me, someone who cares about plant studies, it's exciting to see a conference program with speakers from Morris and the Academy alongside landscape architects and others. Penn's program in landscape architecture, you may know, dates to 1925, just celebrated its centennial. And it ended up being, with the demise of botany here, the standard bearer for garden studies and plant studies at Penn in the 20th century. But garden history back then in the 20th century rarely, I think, brought to the discussion topics like race, imperialism, sovereignty, indigeneity, ethnobotany. And in different but complementary ways, our 3 panelists bring such matters to bear. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will present, and then we'll have a little discussion and Q&A. So Dr. Chelsey Armstrong is a historical ecologist and archaeologist specializing in ancient human land use in the Pacific Northwest. She's the director of the Historical Ecological Research Lab, where she conducts paleoethnobotanical, that's a hard one, historical, ecological, and GIS LIDAR research. Dr. Armstrong is an assistant professor of Indigenous Studies and an associate member at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. Tony Sorrentino joined the Fairmount Park Conservancy in October of 2025, where he serves as the chief executive overseeing all aspects of the organization's strategic leadership, organizational management, resource development, external relations, finances, and board relations in service of its mission to bring parks to life. Tony's a lifelong Philadelphian with deep experience in civic engagement, and he has a real experience here at Penn. For a long time, he was in the office of the executive vice president working on strategic planning and communications, and he holds a master's degree in city planning from the Weitzman School. Our final guest, Vanessa Grossman, is an architect, historian, and curator whose work examines the entanglements of architecture with ideology, governance, and socio-environmental justice. Her research focuses on Cold War-era architecture and urbanism in global context. She's the author of A Concrete Alliance, Communism and Modern Architecture in Post-War France, published by Yale in 2024. More recently, her work has explored historical and spatial connections between the Amazon rainforest and the North American Rust Belt. Grossman is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture right here in the Weitzman School. So please join me in welcoming these three experts.
Good afternoon. Tony Sorrentino. I'm the CEO of the Fairmount Park Conservancy. Did I hit it? Here we are. 90 days on the job. January 27th was day 90. As was mentioned, I started in October, but I was here at Penn for 25 years as a planner. I got very interested in parks and planning as I worked on the Penn Park strategy at 30th and Walnut Street with Michael von Volkenberg. That was a pretty cool experience. We worked with the Olin Partnership in the early 2000s on a magnificent campus plan. And so very interested in campus planning and the blurry lines between a campus and a neighborhood, and how you can plan a campus at the scale of a neighborhood. You don't plan at a neighborhood. And as you all probably know, that's tricky and challenging work. I'll just do a quick commercial on the Fairmount Park Conservancy. It's only been around since 1998. It's modeled after the Central Park Conservancy. And this very idea that a public-private partnership should exist because cities can't often finance the maintenance they need for their parks. And Philadelphia is no different. Most of you know Philadelphia ranks as one of the most impoverished cities in America. It's usually first or second. It's a strange day when you cheer that you're only second, but that happened last year, sadly. This is a city with breaking poverty. A lot of municipal services and money goes to that. And one of the many things that gets starved in the process is the Fairmount Park system, the largest urban park system in America at 10,200 acres. There's no central park in Philadelphia. It's a loose confederacy of neighborhood parks. So what drew me to the job was that there's no park planning, there's neighborhood planning, and you're not neighborhood planning unless you're park planning. And that's kind of Philly in a nutshell. And so that's why we exist in what we do. There's a whole other part of the job, which I've never done before, but it's kind of exciting, maybe, which is government relations. I was saying to a colleague a second ago, I had no idea how political parks were going to be in Philadelphia just in the first 90 days, like down to the ward level, down to the committee person level, getting calls at night at, what's wrong with my swing set? When is the basketball courts going to open? Those kinds of things, really interesting. But we're not the city. We're a private actor. And what we do is we raise money from private sources and to do the private planning. And then we turn the plans over to the city. And so it's an interesting kind of gig. So I'm looking forward to the next phase of my career doing that. I'm just going to show you pictures of some World's Fairs. And why is that? Today we're talking about the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park. 1876 was coming on the heels of several successful World Fairs, whether it be in London or New York, Dublin, Paris. The Gilded Age was mentioned before. This is kind of part of that culture as well. I do want to start by saying, and I'm going to read something that I wrote, which was I'm not a landscape architect, but when we talk about landscape architecture, when I talk about it with my colleagues and peers, they frame it often as something that happens outside. Soils, plants, hydrology, topography. When I was studying 1876, I found a lot of people thinking about landscape architecture as something inside, that the landscape was also something you walked into. both into a park setting and a controlled environment, as well as into actual buildings in celebration of landscape art. We're going to get into some slides on Horticulture Hall, which is the primary thing I'm talking about today. And it was this really wonderful mix of science and technology and plants and architecture that was open to the public, right? This was a time when universities were extremely exclusive. There was very limited access to knowledge, but a World's Fair, as you would see here in these cities, was really open to it. And here in Philly, we had one celebrating the 100th anniversary of the United States in 1876. Quite important to remember, the Civil War was still fresh in people's minds. The South was wrecked. Parts of the lower part of the Union was wrecked. And it's also important to remember that Pennsylvania, called the Keystone State, right? Because when you look at an arch, we're all physical planners. At the very top of the arch is the keystone that locks it together. Pennsylvania was thought of the Keystone State that was going to lock the North and the South together. That if Pennsylvania went with the South, there's a chance things might not have gone right now. Professor Farmer's the historian. I'm not. I hope I got that right, but that's why Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. And so this gives you a sense of what this area looks like. You could see right in the middle of the slide the very prominent location of Horticulture Hall, and just above that, Agriculture Hall. This landscape still exists. You can drive through it right now. It's really quite something. Hundreds of buildings were put up. Almost all of them are gone, except for one or two that we're going to showcase. I think equally important, millions of Americans passed through this landscape in 1876. It was open from May until November. And so as we get into it, I just wanted to mention that there were 10 million people that went through this centennial exhibition, and the population of the United States was 46 million. Right? There's no cars, right? There's no air travel. These people were getting here by train. Special trains were built to go through West Philly to bring people here. And who was coming in? They were statesmen, they were elected officials, farmers, there were professionals, there was people in the business, but it was also the general public. The general public was here to see kind of what you would see in a World's Fair. And I talked about it a little bit in terms of education and kind of why that mattered. It's a really interesting, there were a lot of firsts. Professor Farmer talked about first. It's not the first hot air balloon, but it's one of the first hot air balloons. And you see in the upper right corner. This is another access, looking, so you can see the Schuylkill River there in the background, in the foreground, kind of going, it looks like it's going west to east on this particular vantage. That is a huge building. That was the main hall. Of course, demolished by now. That's not there, but that's a massive piece of construction that was put into this beautiful pastoral landscape. For all the Frederick Law Olmsted nerds out there, Olmsted wrote the first plan for this. He was contacted by Philadelphia to do a plan for this before 1876. He drove around in a horse-drawn carriage, got back to the mayor and said, "I wouldn't do anything. It's perfect. You don't need a plan. Just leave it, and you're good." If anybody knows FDR Park in South Philadelphia, that is an Olmsted plan, so get down there and walk through it. It's really, the vestiges are there of all of his work. And so the World's Fairs are, of course, cultural exchanges with all kinds of impact. But we talked about the Civil War a little bit, this idea of a national identity. You had Southerners coming up to the North, maybe for the first time, and they were bringing plants, and they were bringing seeds, and they were bringing farm equipment. And there were two kinds of people coming to this. There were those going to our Agriculture Hall who were into this, and those going to Horticulture Hall. They probably went back and forth to both. I want you to think of Agriculture Hall as the farm show. We've all been to the farm show. I like the butter cow. We all go to the farm show, and that's what this was. The kind of equipment that people were showing off was really kind of cool. And so just to give you a little bit more interesting images of this, a little closer in, that's that massive building that I talked about, the bottom right there's the foreground of some green space that's all still there right now. We're going to end on that, talk a little bit about what's coming next and trying to pick up the legacy of this. But you were getting farm equipment and machinery, steam-powered threshers for the first time, reapers, seed drills, cultivators, other tools that allowed for mechanization and the transformation of rural labor was being put on live display and demonstrations. And so it wasn't just a display, it was interactive. Before I was a planner, I spent 10 years at the Franklin Institute Science Museum, and I was reading this and I thought, this is almost like the first interactive science museum. People were coming to Ag Hall and getting to play with the drills and the threshers and getting a sense. It must have been really kind of fascinating, and it becomes kind of a repository where it was the only place in the country where all of this was coming together, which is probably why 10 million people kind of went through. There was also exhibits for states who would show up in advance of a year and build their state house. My particular office is the last of the state houses. It's the Ohio House, built from Dayton stone. It says real big on the side of the building. It's the last of, I think, 46 houses that were built, each representing a different state or territory from 1876. The Ohio House is the last one, but really interesting things. Each of these houses were putting on a show. They were showing off their grains, their crops, their tools, their livestock care treatments, how they would process dairy, and they were really getting into agricultural productivity, how to be kind of more efficient. And so you have this kind of living and breathing trade show around farming, and then you go over to the other building, which is Horticulture Hall, kind of a kissing cousin, but not quite related. And this is really one of the most popular parts of the Centennial exhibition. And so I wanted, before I get into that, just to give you a sense of what these buildings looked like that were being built from kind of top down. That one's still there, right, on the top left. That is known as Memorial Hall, now home to the Police Touch Museum, a magnificent piece of architecture. There was the main building, there was Ag Hall, Machinery Hall, Horticulture Hall, and there was a women's pavilion. It was actually one of Benjamin Franklin's descendants, and it was basically designed to celebrate women's rights. So it didn't have much to do with agriculture or mechanics or even commerce or trade. It was a political moment in time to get women active in public life. So really kind of fascinating. And so just to give you a sense of what the main hall looked like, exterior and interior, really interesting. By the way, more Currier and Ives lithographs that you could shake a stick at. This is a very well kind of documented World's Fair. Machinery Hall, you're talking about really big, powerful machines being displayed for the first time. Here's the Agricultural Hall, exterior, interior, that was pointed out before. You could think that's like giant bottles of wine there. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But what you'll notice for the architects in the house, a lot of natural light, a lot of glass. And this also comes into relevance around the plant material as well, how it's displayed, how people can see it. You want to see it in as much of a natural setting. So at what point does architecture become a kind of vessel for looking at landscape? That's what I was talking about by bringing the outside to the inside, which was really quite fun. Just a couple of fun little things. The first public demonstration of the telephone, Bell himself was there. The middle image is the very first time popcorn was made in public. That is an open fire with corn over some kind of grate. You can see the guys holding it and people looking on in great interest. And of course, you've recognized the torch from the Statue of Liberty, which was assembled in New York, but on its way to New York, that was put on display in Philadelphia, right here, West Philadelphia, in West Fairmount Park. And so we get to the Horticultural Hall, you know, and why it matters. And you can see this really interesting building, which is sadly gone. It was taken down in 1955. It got beat up by Hurricane Hazel, a really bad storm in the mid 1950s. But there was no real culture of preservation, so whatever water damage happened. And I think they just thought, we'll take it down. But you could start to see the kind of very verdant life inside of this building on the image on the right-hand side. And so when I look at this image, I think it is this real interesting fusion of architecture and horticulture, this kind of public landscape, but put on display almost as if you're in a museum of art. And I start to wonder, I'm not a historian of this, but is this a precedent of botanical gardens, of conservatories or civic greenhouses? And was this just a building, or was this an event? Was this the beginning of something else, maybe a movement? And so I showed you before how well sited it was on the plan, like right in the middle of the very strong access. So this was even plotted in a way to be incredibly popular and to bring people through. A couple different looks at it. I love the approach to it, these really beautiful circular paths. There's some sunken gardens before. I'm going to talk about that in a second and the importance of sunken gardens. The vestiges are there, but we're going to try to bring the sunken gardens back to West Fairmount Park. It's going to be a big fundraising effort, but I think we can do it. But, you know, I look at some of these, there we go, on these are called Fountain Avenue. I mean, how incredible is that with some of these sunken gardens? And I wrote down biophilic design. only because I don't know what it means. So can someone tell me what it means? There's got to be a landscape person to give me a quick definition. My note says, ask audience what design is. Sue, can I call on you? That's perfect. Or unhappy, thank you. So millions of people are going through this World's Fair, and they're seeing everything from, they're tasting popcorn for the first time. Heinz ketchup was brought over from Western Pennsylvania and tasted for the first time. Like, really interesting things are going on, and yet Agricultural Hall is really getting a lot of people. And so what I like about the image on the left and on the right is, on the right is a kind of strange, ghostly kind of drawing of what would be kind of a gazebo kind of structure, kind of layered on top of whatever the early photography was. Back then, people were thinking about siting, obviously. And the grounds were really interesting. So this would be looking from the hall back out into the park, and what you were seeing, this really kind of civic approach. It's really long kind of promenades. I love these images of these women in their parasols and their long coats kind of down there close to the bottom left. You could see the elements, the architectural elements on the right side. Just the real intricate work, these drawings inside of what it would look like when you walked in, these magnificent staircases, kind of the reveal of these plants that you'd be going through. There was a reference to kind of tropical or palms. You could see them on display as well in these drawings here on the bottom right. And as much as people were going through it for learning, it was as much entertainment. This was a form of entertainment. You went out to see these plants that you'd never seen before, and you started to think about how one brings the outside to the inside. And so that I showed you some of the drawings. That's the actual images from the interior, really quite something. When I looked at this, I did a double take, having spent so many years in this building, kind of walking in and seeing that iron staircase. That's a very Philly piece of architecture right there. That's very furnace. That's very, we're going to bring the machine age into, look at the gears kind of turning at the top of those stairs, kind of on top of each other, which is really quite cool. There was a whole section called the Floral Hall, and you could see the construction workers right there building what was going to be a kind of a circular garden experience that you would go through in a circle and experience the way the plant material would be looked. So I love that image of the building is, the envelope is done, but now they're on the inside trying to figure out what it's going to look like. And so for the plant nerds that are in the house, they're going to know what these plants are better than I am, but really quite interesting to see these photographs of what was on display. I'm not going to try to pronounce them. I'll only embarrass myself and you in the process. But in the bottom right to the left, you see the banana plant, and crowd favorite. Bananas were incredibly popular, being kind of introduced also with popcorn and ketchup. I don't think they all went together, but I found an article that was written in the Philadelphia Ledger, where it had a description of eating a banana for the first time with a knife and a fork. That you unpeeled it, and apparently you held it from the stem. You didn't peel it. So you held it from the stem, and you started at the top, and then you were to hold it if you didn't use a fork and knife. So I haven't eaten a banana the same way since. But yeah, let's do fork and knife and kind of go through it. And so I love kind of this idea of we're going to bring the outside in and we're going to put it on display. Such great stereo photography from that age. Again, it's an example of that entrance when you go in with that architecture that kind of shows off. There was also a certain amount of commerce going on, like plants as commerce, plants as trade, seeds as trade. This idea that you would talk about cultivation techniques. You'd go to it's like a trade show now. It's like our agricultural hall, and you've got people talking about greenhouse technologies or glasshouse technologies, disease knowledge, sharing information about disease and pest control. And so professional networks are forming. So it's entertainment and a trade show. This is slightly different than anything we might see today. You go to a trade show maybe for work, but not for fun. This was a place that was hosting both kinds of people. And of course, people were coming also from all over the world. There was a huge base of participants from Japan. After the United States, the Japanese were the number one participants, both as attendees and exhibitors, but also all over Europe and other parts of Asia and North America. And so I've been thinking about, I was talking about the sunken gardens. I love that. By the way, I'm trying to find out if a push mower back then would have been a big deal. You see that guy in his kind of hat and his. Does anybody have any idea would a push mower be odd in 1876? They seem to be making a big deal of the push mower in the foreground of this picture. But I'm just really digging this image of this woman in the white parasol and that kind of sunken garden. The description that I found was that you are to enjoy the garden from above, to look down, and to appreciate the design, the color, the diversity, and the plant material. Hey, Dean. And just kind of, you enjoy it almost as a theatrical experience as you're kind of going around it, which was probably different. So we talked about bringing the exterior to the interior. There's as much care, it looks like, on the exterior as well, the approach up into it. And so a really interesting element as well, kind of wrapping up this part, was there was a public education part to this where there were demonstrations and lectures on taxonomy and plant classification that people were going through, which was also really fun. So the sunken gardens, they're gone, but I found, I went out and took this picture, our staff took this picture last spring, it was in our files. If you've never been out there during cherry blossom season, it's exceptional. It's worth going out and seeing. So that fountain on your left is still there, on your right under a beautiful cherry tree. But that sunken garden, and all of them have gone away. And I've been wondering how much it would cost to bring back a kind of network of sunken gardens in and around that area that we've been doing. So after the centennial comes and goes, and there's 10 million people have had a good time, there's the kind of these vestiges, right? It becomes a little bit of a museum, a little bit of a trade show. I would say it's an educational institution. You had scientific societies going through. And the questions that I've been asking as I went through this was, is this a certain rise of the introduction of kind of like, I don't know, horticulture? I won't call it horticulture in the sense that you all as experts know it, but kind of horticulture for the layperson, a person who's going to start gardening, a person who's going to start trying to understand the diversity. And if they're looking at some of these non-native plants, is this the introduction of invasive species that people get into and then start bringing into their homes and into their gardens? And is that where they're, because there was an aggressive kind of trade and commerce and plant importation, and people were talking about, the value of crop diversification. People were falling, especially at the Gilded Age, this kind of ornamentality of it, the ornamentation of it. There's, of course, the unintended consequences that I just mentioned, right? There's, I mean, to say nothing of colonial extraction of plant and plant knowledge, and maybe ecological imbalance. I think there should be an actual debate about, when you're doing that kind of trade, about the ethics of it, or the bio integrity of it. And so, but after the centennial comes and goes, it turns into like a really lovely public fairground and a picnic ground. So as I mentioned before, Olmsted did the first concept of it and said to the city, it's perfect as it is, leave it alone. So instead of actually ever being planned as a park, it was planned as a fairground, which is why you go there now. There's vast lanes of traffic moving through. I've spent the first 90 days doing studies to see what we could do for traffic calming. People are getting hit on their bikes all the time. It's very scary out there. Way too much fast-moving traffic for it to be a park. And so it never got designed to be the park. It got to be a fairground. How do we correct that? And in correcting it, can we do a kind of garden preservation around it? Could we do that? I'm going to end with a picture that's really kind of fun as well. And I just, I talked about this a little bit, how the Hurricane Hazel kind of blew it apart from all the water damage. That just shows you kind of a triptych of it's in construction, it's in full bloom, and then when the plant material went away, that's what the interior of it looked like. It didn't really stay as a robust garden the way that maybe we thought it would have. And so today it was rebuilt in the 70s. It's a really popular wedding venue. It's really beautiful. You could see the Cherry Blossom Festival images there as well. You could see the river there in the background. It's really a special part. There is a small little arboretum in there. I mentioned the Ohio House where I work at, that the one light that's on, that's me working late at night. But that's Ohio House. Fritz, did you know that? You're an Ohioan. You knew that? Yeah, okay. Police Dutch Museum, Memorial, the zoo, opened right before the centennial, but the architecture that went up in the zoo very much matched what was going on. The great Japanese house, built on site, relocated to MoMA for display in Manhattan, taken apart, brought back to Philadelphia. It's been here ever since. Really kind of beautiful stuff. So Memorial Hall, quite something. We are working with Tom Woltz, Bryant Woltz, who who did a design to restore what is called here the John Welsh Memorial. He ran the Centennial. In the 1920s, this fountain and these gardens were built to honor him. This is looking from the Police Touch Museum towards Parkside, and this is the first rendering that he turned in. And we're going to bring back this fountain, which is almost as big as Logan Fountain on the Parkway. We're going to bring water back. It's all still there. It got turned off in 1976 after the bicentennial. The city was at junk bond status. Frank Rizzo, the mayor, was not having any extra money on anything ornamental. But we're going to try to bring this back. And again, an example of a public-private partnership. The city of Philadelphia was like, God bless you, go for it. Go raise the money, go do the plans. We'll give you a kind of lease. And like Bryant Park, perhaps it becomes public-privately managed. And so an organization like mine would then run the capital project. It's estimated at 15 million right now. I raised the first 7 last week. It came in, which is quite good. So we're halfway there. And I'm going to sell off each of the 4 corners too, to people who want to support this. So that's the future of it. And I just wanted to say that we're trying to keep that legacy of kind of public garden alive there, even though what was on display is physically gone. I think Philly has the kind of spirit where we can keep that alive. So I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Well, maybe I should just start by thank you so much, Catherine, for having me. 1 year ago, we were also organizing an event that relates to my talk today. So I really thank you and the team for having me as part of Adventive America. I am myself Adventive to plant studies and to Philadelphia, but I'm here to talk about both. So my talk is called Adventive EVEA, Rubber, Empire, and Industrial Ecologies from the Amazon to the Rust Belt. Why is this not? Oh yeah, here. So a 1970 issue of the Botanical Review dedicated to the history of taxonomic studies in EVEA by North American biologist Richard Evans Schutz, considered the father of modern ethnobotany, opens with his observation, and I quote, "Few economic plants have more deeply affected civilization than the para rubber tree, Evea brasiliensis, the product of which has made possible present-day transportation and much of modern industry and technology." End of quote. Schutz also noted that this tropical tree represents, and I quote, "one of humanity's most recently domesticated plants." If the rubber tree came to deeply affect civilization as he observed, its impact was especially pronounced amid the United States industrial and territorial expansion, where the domestication of EVEA became inseparable from national projects of modernization, imperialism, and global reach. Yet domestication, far from a straightforward botanical achievement, unfolded through complex transnational processes rooted largely in the Amazon rainforest. To describe EVEA as domesticated, therefore, is not to signal a completed transformation, but to recognize a historical process that shaped broader environments, nation-building efforts, and shifting global power dynamics. Can I go to the next slide? I'm not sure why it's not working. Yeah. So Amazonia, the Earth's largest tropical rainforest, now increasingly recognized as a domesticated landscape shaped by indigenous peoples since the earliest phases of civilization, has long been the target of external projects of monoculture, extraction, classification, and control, though never without resistance. This paper argues that despite its apparent remoteness, the Amazon rainforest has always been intrinsically connected to the global industrial world and deeply entangled with the United States, particularly regions like Pennsylvania and cities such as Philadelphia, which were central to industrial development and the production of technologies reliant on Amazonian resources. These connections are rooted in the geopolitics of resource extraction, which fueled the Industrial Revolution and facilitated the late 19th century shift in global power from the British Empire to the United States. In particular, the EVEA tree played a decisive role in making these projects and the region's impact on global history both immediate and tangible. And here is a newspaper clipping showing that even pine lumber was shipped from the United States to the Amazon for the constructions of an infamous railway linked to the rubber exploitation, which I will discuss. The global history of this civilizational tree, therefore, reveals not only the challenges of its domestication, but also that the Amazon, Despite experiencing its most extensive and catastrophic environmental transformation since the 1970s, was never the remote or uncharted frontier, of course I'm using it here in quotation marks, often imagined in Western thought since the Enlightenment. Rather, it has long been deeply entwined with the processes of modernization that enabled modern science and even a carbon-based economy. Processes profoundly dependent on it, yet frequently erasing indigenous knowledges. In this light, EVEA and its ecosystems, alongside other agents of the forest, have both facilitated and constrained the trajectories of modernity. In fact, from the perspective of global trade and the long path to industrialization, rubber and the Americas have been intimately connected for centuries. Rubber's remarkable journey to global awareness began in the late 15th century when Christopher Columbus returned from his second voyage to the Indies, later called the New World. Of course, you all know, with a ball of an extraordinary material apparently sourced from the Antilles. Commonly called India rubber, the name reflected European trade routes and assumptions rather than the plant's true American origin. As European science began to study the substance systematically, rubber attracted renewed attention. During his famous expedition to the Amazon to measure the Earth's curvature at the equator, an effort heavily guided by indigenous knowledge that has never been acknowledged, Charles-Marie Lacondamine noted that in Quito, the material was known as caoutchouc or caoutchouc. In his 1745 report to the French Academy of Sciences, he emphasized its practical potential. Freshly collected resin could be molded into virtually any shape. He also introduced European audiences to Evea and Chichona, two species then largely unknown outside the Americas. Lacondamine's observations helped catalyze European scientific curiosity and industrial experimentation with latex, situating the Amazon as a key site within the global network of knowledge and resource extraction. Despite earlier European encounters with latex, systematic botanical studies of Evea began only in 1775 with Fusée Oblé's description of Evea's guyanensis in Histoire des plantes de la Guinée française, French Guiana, where he had documented Amazonian species for European science. A further milestone came in 1825 when German botanist Karl Kunz classified specimens collected by Alexander von Humboldt along the Rio Tuamino near Javita and the Rio Orinoco at San Fernando de Atapabo in southern Venezuela. By the 19th century, Evea brasiliensis, the Pará rubber tree native to the Amazon basin, especially in Brazil, had emerged as the most economically significant species, its latex becoming central to industrial economies in Europe and the United States. Evea's taxonomic history in the West mirrors the consolidation of modern botanical nomenclature while tracing latex transformation from a regional botanical curiosity to a global circulated material. Through these classificatory and experimental regimes, Evea became integral to the built environment, enabling shoes, vehicle tires, and eventually the expansion of highways and asphalt paving, and repositioning of forest species from the Amazon as a material agent shaping infrastructure, mobility, and urban life far beyond its native landscape. Planting an empire, Evea elastic and rubber machines in Centennial America. One of the most shifting moments in the modern history of rubber occurred in the United States. It is largely known that in 1839, Charles Goodyear, a self-taught Connecticut-based chemist, accidentally discovered vulcanization by dropping a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove. Patented in 1844, vulcanization laid the groundwork for the modern rubber industry, including the Goodyear Tire Company founded in 1898, which became emblematic of the automobile age, a period that drove intensified industrial exploitation of Amazonian rubber. Despite legal battles and personal poverty, Goodyear's discovery reshaped industrial possibilities, making rubber a linchpin of the U.S. manufacturing global trade. Rubber entered American public consciousness most visibly at the Centennial International Exhibition we just heard a lot about. Brazil's exhibits were distinguished from those of other South American republics. It was not a republic, in fact, it was an empire, reflecting its ambiguous political status as a monarchy poised between colonial pasts and imperial futures. You can see the pavilion very centrally here, the fairground of the exhibition. So, in May 10, 1876, Presidents Grant and Dom Pedro II, the second and final emperor of the then Empire of Brazil, inaugurated the exhibition together, activating the massive Corliss steam engine that powered the fair. Dom Pedro II famously marveled at Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, exclaiming, and I quote, "My God, it talks." As J.S. Ingram notes in this book, The Centennial Exposition, Brazil's display were described as, and I quote, the most important and interesting from an empire which occupies 3/7 of the South American continent, a territory larger than any government in the world except Russia. Ingram observed, and I quote, the provinces of Pará and Amazonas, where the Eveia elastica, from which this valuable product is extracted, grows profusely from the seaboard to a distance of nearly 2,000 miles inland, furnished the chief supply of caoutchouc. The exports of India rubber in 1873 and 1874 amounted to 14,819,870 pounds, valued at, well, a big amount. Caoutchouc featured prominently among the miscellaneous exhibits, signaling Brazil's growing economic significance. Rubber machinery was also prominently displayed in the United States section, highlighting the technological transformations that made rubber indispensable to modern manufacturing. The juxtaposition of plant specimens and industrial machines reflected the imperial ambitions of a nation emerging from the trauma of the Civil War. Tropical plants were not curiosities, birds, but strategic resources, essential to lubricants, resins, ropes, gums, and tannins. The Centennial Exhibition thus linked the forests of the Amazon to Philadelphia's industrial future, anticipating deeper American involvement in rubber extraction and industrial rubber economy. The exhibition also reflected the nation's post-Civil War industrial ambitions, showcasing plants as strategic agents in national economic recovery and global competitiveness. Inland rubber, Philadelphia's Devil's Railroad in the Amazon. 2 years after the Centennial Exhibition, another connection emerged between Philadelphia and the Amazon through Eveia. In 1878, Robert Hopewell Hepburn, a young engineer and Princeton graduate like me, he was class of 1871, affiliated with the Pennsylvania Railroad, PRR, founded in 1846 and headquartered in Philadelphia, traveled to Brazil to help construct the infamous Madeira-Mamoré Railway along the upper Madeira River, a major Amazon tributary flowing north from Bolivia through Brazil. Rapids and waterfalls blocked navigation, making the railway essential for transporting rubber from the interior to global markets. Its construction demanded extraordinary labor under brutal conditions, the unforgiving climate, the threat of wild animals, and malaria and yellow fever-bearing mosquitoes. The forest's greatest ecologists, highlighting the extreme human cost of the so-called rubber boom. This transnational venture was shaped not only by human ambition, but also by the agency of Eveia Brasiliensis. The tree's immense but widely scattered distribution across the Amazon both created the economic imperative for the railway and made extraction and transport extraordinarily difficult, while malaria and mosquitoes further deterred human presence. American involvement followed this ecological economic force. Pennsylvania entrepreneurs such as Percival Farquhar financed and oversaw construction, while PRR engineers like Hepburn provided technical expertise. They departed from Philadelphia with engineers, other workers, and tons of machinery, tools, and mineral coal. Although the railway ultimately failed due to competition from Asian rubber, it earned, and later synthetic rubber, of course, it earned the nickname the Devil's Railway for its staggering human toll and engineering challenges reflecting early U.S. engagement in Amazonian development and industrial rubber economy. Hepburn's journey reveals how Eveia mediated technology, labor, and capital between Philadelphia and the Amazon. Dana Merrill, a New York photographer, documented the railway's construction. By 1897, and you can see here the famous cemetery where many workers were buried. And by 1897, the first annual reunion of the Association of Surviving Members of the Madeira-Mamoré Railway Expedition was actually held in Philadelphia. This invitation announces a 1906 dinner of the Madeira-Mamoré Association, also in Philly, with its menu, and you can find all the details about it. And additional images that are in the same archival collections circulated as postcards, including one sent in 1914 by Hepburn's son to 1631 Spruce Street, which is in fact across the brownstone where my own apartment now stands. So he was my neighbor. Where Hepburn lived, which in fact retraces his father's journey. His son retraced the father's journey 29 years later and mailed this postcard from Brazil. And one such postcard depicted the Caripun indigenous population, which were actually, entered into a major confrontation, died of all sorts of disease. And so this is a very exoticizing imagery and language that explicitly referenced indigenous genocide. Rubber and the American documentation, the Penn Museum. By 1869, Pará rubber, derived from Hevea brasiliensis, tree native to the Brazilian Amazon, was recognized for its industrial potential due to its chemical properties and suitability for plantation cultivation in Southeast Asia. Lacking biological expertise and viable seeds, British planters relied on adventurer Henry Wickham, who allegedly collected some 70,000 Hevea seeds in Brazil and smuggled them to Joseph Hooker at Kew Gardens in London, from which nearly 2,000 seedlings were dispatched to Sri Lanka by August. While British plantations flourished abroad, the immense values and scattered distribution of Hevea in the Amazon intensified the extraction, driving collectors deep into the forest and fueling labor systems under human direction. England alone imported 58,710 kilograms in 1874, 6 times its imports 2 decades earlier. So another more than human actor further shaped this history. A devastating leaf-blind fungus struck Hevea species in South America, undermining plantation productivity, while the same trees thrived in Asia free from disease. These ecological and technological pressures coincided with the rapid rise of Amazonian cities such as Belém, here with an opera house in Hepburn's collected memorabilia, and Manaus, the latter a Belle Époque capital, both of them actually, and one of the first in Brazil to be electrified, deep in the Amazon, propelled by the wealth of the late 19th century rubber boom. The Amazonian capital became celebrated for its modern infrastructure, including electric lighting and streetcars, only to decline once seedlings were smuggled abroad and capital departed. The centrality of the tree also guided exploration. So Theodore Roosevelt's famous Roosevelt and Rondon expedition traversed the Rio da Dúvida, a region crucial to rubber extraction, following routes cut decades earlier by Colonel Cândido Rondon, Telegraph Commission, illustrating how ecological and technological forces intersected with this drive for exploration in the Amazon. And despite Hevea's resistance to monoculture, humans extracted its economic value through extreme violence. Predatory rubber barons exploited indigenous and local populations under coercive labor systems, culminating in atrocities such as the famous Putumayo genocide from 1899 to 1912, in which the Peruvian Amazon Company systematically enslaved, abused, and murdered indigenous communities to harvest latex. Investigators from Britain and the United States documented these abuses between 1909 and 1913. The social and cultural devastations wrought by this extraction drew the attention of U.S. museums, eager to collect ethnographic and natural objects before indigenous lifeways were further disrupted. In 1913, the Penn Museum sent American anthropologist William Curtis Farabee into the Amazon to document indigenous peoples and their lifeways, driven both by what contemporaries called moral urgency and by the era's competitive drive to build the nation's largest collections. At the heart of this enterprise was Hevea brasiliensis. It sap-fueled economic expansion, guided exploration, and the extreme human violence that actually drove Farabee to, gather those objects, images, and records he collected. His expedition into what he termed the known territories, conducted amid the devastation wrought by rubber extraction, produced artifacts, photographs, and notebooks that became central to the museum's South American holdings. Farabee documented the lives of groups such as the Wapsiana, Taruma, and Ataroy at a moment when local rubber barons, including Peruvian entrepreneur Julio César Arana, had enslaved and massacred thousands, preserving evidence of indigenous lifeways, rituals, and ingenuity, while also exposing the problematic ways Western museums acquired such collections, entangling knowledge production with the cultural dispossession. The journey exacted a heavy personal toll. Farabee contracted severe dysentery, underwent more than 30 blood transfusions upon his return, and ultimately succumbed in 1925, his life and work inseparable from both the promise and the devastation of the Amazonian rubber boom. The Romance of Rubber. A children's book titled The Romance of Rubber, published in 1928 by the United States Rubber Company, founded in 1892 and later one of the original Dow Jones Industrial Average stocks, declared its publisher the largest rubber manufacturer in the world, while celebrating the Amazon's so-called rubber belt, the planet's richest reserve of natural rubber. Framed as an educational story and paired with advertisements for kids, the book transformed imperial resource extraction into a tale portraying rubber as a harmless everyday material. Behind the heroic illustrations and against a backdrop of primitivism lay an extractive system built on colonial violence, coerced labor, and the consolidation of global economic power. Meanwhile, the advertised Lycoming Rubber Company plant in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, operated by U.S. Rubber, was producing cat sneakers at one of the largest factories of its kind, linking the Amazon steppe trees directly to the sole of American children's shoes. In 1928, Henry Ford launched Fordlandia in the Brazilian Amazon, an ambitious attempt to secure rubber for his automobiles through an American-style company town. By transplanting U.S. cultural norms, industrial discipline, and monocrop plantations into a complex tropical ecosystem, the project quickly unraveled under the pressures of disease, ecological miscalculations, and worker resistance. Abandoned in the 40s, Fordlandia became a stark emblem of industrial hubris. The failure of Fordlandia reveals the limit of technological determinism. Hevea brasiliensis, along with non-human agents such as leaf blight fungus, resisted forced colonial ambitions, leaving behind a rusting jungle ghost town that eerily mirrors the fate of some of the facilities in Detroit. Yet, the testimony of the rubber tree, once displayed like the machines Dom Pedro II witnessed at the Centennial Exposition, later displaced by synthetic rubber, did not halt the ongoing extraction of Amazonian resources from manganese and iron ore to gold. There is no time here to fully trace these industries or the material ties linking Pennsylvania and the Rust Belt to the world's largest tropical forest across the 20th and 21st century, but their persistence underscores a lesson repeatedly unlearned. The monocultural logic that doomed rubber plantations continue to threaten Amazonia today, where ecological exhaustion and creeping desertification mark the enduring consequences of ignoring what the rubber tree, famously humanized and subjectified in José Eustáquio Rivera's The Vortex, as a tree carrying, and I quote, the white blood of the gods, had already revealed. So now that we finally acknowledge that trees can talk, and that they communicate, one can almost hear Dom Pedro II marvel again, exclaiming, "My God, it talks." This time, not to the telephone, but Hevea itself. Thank you.
So before turning it over to the audience for questions, I want to make a connection because I actually think these three papers, even though they were quite different, have a connection, and I want to share the connection I see. Then I want to ask all of you what connections you see before we turn it over. Because I'll start with you, because I want to say, Chelsey, that your presentation begs the question: how is it very learned people show up and they see agriculture, people tending plants right in front of their eyes, but they don't see it, right? So how did this a certain idea of what agriculture is become so fixed in the imagination that you don't actually see what's right in front of your eyes? So I think part of the answer is the horticultural hall, right, in Philadelphia. But then you have to think of that hall times 1,000, because every single state and territory in that states on every anniversary, every commemorative moment, had a hall like that. Halls like that were just multiplied over and over again, across the land. In Europe too, but especially in America. In the long 19th century. And that's partly how people learned what agriculture is. And so basically they learned a certain schema. I want to say, the 19th century is the century, where people are creating these categories, and many of these categories still, rule our thinking, and, they rule our universities to some degree, because our university is all about categories, which were invented in the 19th century. So in a very simplified way, I want to say the schema people were learning in the agricultural hall and the horticultural hall is that, forests have resource trees, mostly timber, but also rubber, right? Resource trees. They don't have crops. They don't have gardens, right? And then farms have crops. They don't have trees, except maybe on the boundaries or along, the driveway, that kind of thing. Orchards, you have fruit trees, but they don't have timber trees, right? And then botanical gardens have all kinds of flowering trees, but they don't have orchard trees. And, you could have parks and on, right? And that's a simplified schema, but that is kind of what these pedagogical spaces are. So I think that's the connection I see. I mean, it's wow, we got the rubber tree in the hall, and that's helping to educate people in the sense not to see the agriculture that is right there. So I want to ask all of you, like, do you see other connections between these three, or connections to other talks you heard earlier today?
I think you nailed it. I mean, there's obviously a commercial connection through all of these things, which is really fascinating, which I didn't appreciate too much until now. But this idea of creating a kind of a learned society out of people who don't have advanced education, and that the idea that there are journals that people are reading around the country that you can maybe get, or magazines, popular press that you can get information about plants, kind of bringing the outdoor in. But also, people are making their living directly and indirectly from this, whether it's in the forestry business, whether it's in advanced manufacturing that relies on rubber, whether it's in foodstuffs and agriculture in your part. I see this kind of unbroken line between a kind of private interest that's able to manipulate the land, and then simultaneously or coterminously, you're also exhibiting it for pleasure. Like there's two kinds of consumption going on that I didn't think about until today.
To me, as a historian of, can you hear me? Oh, they're recording. No. To me, like as a historian of architecture, to present this whole history without talking about the architecture is actually, you went through like all the pavilions, and I find it fascinating to, the way I learned about 19th century, international exhibitions is a kind of like a prelude to like modernism, and how detached those very romantic, historicist kind of catalog of forms and styles, which is how we used to learn about architecture, is so detached from what the background, and all the circuits of, what constitutes like this imperial power, display of wealth and materiality. So, today I didn't talk about architecture, and I love that you talked about it before me. And it's also a history that I'm, adventive to, because I'm not, I was not dealing with plants before, but I was very interested in Cold War geopolitics. And I taught a class here which was about I actually didn't know that there were so many connections between the Amazon. It was about Amazonian landscapes and forest histories of architecture. And I thought, how can I get some sort of connection to the institutions here, which are so rich, and there are some Amazonian objects at Penn Museum. I didn't know that there was such an intrinsic connection between Philadelphia and the Amazon. So the class became a new research project to me, which I had, because I lived in the Amazon as a child in a company town. So this is where, but I had no idea. And, even the company town where I lived was discovered by a U.S. steel pilot, flying to try to, the U.S. presence in Cold War and military dictatorship Brazil. So to me, like you went through the pavilions, and we have this legacy. Some pavilions didn't resist, others persist. And it's so interesting to see the 19th century as this century of like science and knowledge and display, and architecture very complicit and very neutral, because this is how I learned when I was a student of architecture. And so when the new research that I'm doing actually, brings a new light to those styles, and I'm not the only one for sure. I mean, many, many historians of architecture are now looking at the 19th century. So this is what makes, and I mean, to understand plants as part of that history. Well, I'm here to learn from all of you because I'm new to the field, and I, when Catherine invited me, I was very excited to think of EVEA connecting all the dots that actually are scattered between the Amazon and Philadelphia. So it was super interesting.
Okay. We'll turn it over to the audience now. I think there are people with microphones. Yeah, there's a guy with a microphone in the back. So just raise your hand high if you have a question for any of us here. We're here.
I just was struck by the architecture in Philadelphia, and how it seems to refer to religious architecture a lot. And I think that that seems to connect all of these things when we're imagining a new framework for understanding our relationship to wildness or something else. I think that's like culture building that was at that time in the employ of colonialism and empire, but could be like the idea of like maybe not religion, but like that's what that architecture is referring to. It's trying to bring other like people in. So I guess the art aspect of this, I was wondering if people could comment on more.
Did you see a kind of sacredness in the designs? Is that what you mean? There was a sacred quality to it?
Reference to like medieval architecture a lot.
Yeah.
In churches, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an architectural historian or a Philadelphia historian, but when I look at those buildings that were designed, built, and then taken down for the express purpose, there is something sacred about those buildings and the way that they are displaying what's inside of them. And we just talked mostly about agriculture and horticulture, but yeah, there's a certain elevation of mechanics. I never put together the kind of church-like quality to it, but there's something being platformed in there that says, this is important. We're shining a light on this. That'd be a really fun thing to compare, kind of the interior of Horticultural Hall to the interior of St. Paul's in London. If there's anything similar. But yeah, I don't know.
This room, I don't know what was in here originally when Frank Furness designed it. Kind of is a church, like it's an industrial church. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts as an architect?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the 19th century is a century of eclecticism, so it's a revival of neo-Roman, neo-Baroque and neo-Renaissance and worldwide. But then the new materials were being used, and revisiting all those styles from the past, and also like preservation of like the Notre Dame, for example, in Paris. So I mean, I'm not gonna hold a history of architecture class but that's the kind of paving the way for Art Nouveau and then modernism, because then there was a need. Well, there are like new materials. Why are we building, like why are we redesigning the styles from the past? And then architects started looking at silos and all the kind of, functionalist architecture of industrial facilities, and that really informed the birth of modernism. But it's fascinating to see, the kind of all the violence that is related to, the new industrial world, and how architecture was somehow, all nations were trying to outweigh the other through eclecticism, and that's the kind of history of 19th century architecture, and with all the kind of, problems in the background that we see, and all the questions of like, this global empire. I mean, there's someone, was kind of like doing the work and being murdered somewhere in the planet for that to happen.
Just add to that, like who has the biggest glass house,
Exactly.
with the biggest cycads and the tallest palms, and
Exactly.
and the whole
Biggest spans and.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Chelsey, I already kind of fangirled to you a little bit, but I'm so happy that you're here. I wanted to turn it back to the forest gardens as well as the agriculture that you presented today. And I want to hear a little bit more about like today's reclaiming of these spaces and cultivation, as well as just ties to the plants. And I also want to invite Vanessa, if you have a rubber standpoint on like reclaiming that cultural plant.
Test. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I always say the archaeology and the ethnobotany of forest gardens is like really cool. But when you are working in community, the question is always, how do you bring these places back? And so we often kind of encourage in situ management because they exist, they're there, rather than, starting something from scratch, which requires a lot of like world building. You have to create soils first. These are like, rich, where's my soil people at? Just incredibly rich soils for these things to grow, right? And they've been made over time. So the story starts below ground. And so we encourage in situ maintenance and conservation. And that's really hard going back to the categories. I mean, there's two ways to really protect or conserve these places under settler colonial law, which is through like the Heritage Conservation Act. That's the archaeology route, the heritage route, or the at-risk species. So those are the two. And the problem is that archaeologists say, well, that's not an archaeological site. Where's the midden? Where's the artifacts? And on the other hand, the macroecologist or biologist will say, well, none of these plants are at risk. Like, I've seen high bush cranberry growing on the highway. It's like, yeah, but it's all the things together in one spot. So there actually isn't currently a mechanism in one of the places I work that has the largest forest garden we've identified to date. It's 20 square kilometers. It's incredible. There's a natural gas pipeline that will be built right down the center line of it in the next year. And so yeah, there is a lot of problems around the protection and maintenance and kind of building these things into the future, but it is high on folks' priority list for sure.
Thank you so much for this question, Laura. I love this question. I do not have an answer for it, but I think I would have loved to end up with this, knowledge about the reclaiming of Evea than with Dom Pedro, of course, talking about, the telephone, because I think it would add a lot to this research to understand what is the kind of contemporary reclaim of Evea. I don't know, Catherine, do you know anything about it? I don't know it. But that's a great question. I'll look into it.
Hi, I have a piggybacking off that question. The panel topic is empire, and I always feel like empire is like ordering and structuring, and so it's a question for all three of you, but I'm just wondering, in your study and as you were, kind of delving into this topic, I'm always interested in like what do we miss when we become too beholden to this idea of like organizing, like what are we missing when we're dreaming only an empire, if that makes sense?
I don't know how to answer that, but when the 1876 centennial was being planned, it was to celebrate a new American empire. I mean, 1876, the nation was 100 years old, and it's still kind of the baby of the world. When you look at most, societies, it's going to be 250 years old as a participatory democracy. Catch it while you can. It's like right now, and so it's interesting to think about how they thought about empire building in 1876 when the nation was 100 years old and just came out of the bloodiest, most brutal war, family against family that you can imagine. What are we missing? I don't know, but there was certainly a lot of taxonomy going on, a lot of organizing, a lot of labeling. And I think the Centennial exhibition was a demonstration of kind of might. Like, look at what we've become, look what we can do, look how advanced we are. I think whenever you are doing that kind of categorizing, you're going to miss something. So they probably weren't complete. But in the study that I did on 1876, there was an indirect goal of unifying a wounded country. There was no explicit goal that this would be a post-Civil War kumbaya moment. Maybe they missed that. I'm an expert in none of this, and I'm faking my way through this pretty well. You got to admit.
I think it's interesting to think of like these dreams of bigness, from that period, like this idea of dominating the world, which was really like, we know the consequences for 20th century. Like this is kind of, the laboratory and paving the way at a large cost, and then what unfolded was, mass murder kept going. I think it's also interesting, especially, Clarice Figueiredo is here, our PhD student in architecture, and she's doing a PhD project about, which actually has a lot to do with dreams. So I feel like looking into like the way in which, the Yanomami talk about dreams, dreams of gold, but dreams for their culture, like the way they dream. So I feel like, your dissertation is really responding to this kind of clash, like who's dreaming and, the kind of, and how do this project of modernization deeply entwined with like the forest, the Amazon forest. I think that this is a big project for Clarice. So do you want to say something? I'm putting the spot on you, sorry, but yeah.
I guess I can just finish by saying, like, I don't know, the empire is here today, right now. Like it's the 200 years. I see it in our regulatory system. I mean, it's Graeber's idea of the bureaucracy is the new imperialism, right? Like this has been talked about, but I will say that this idea of land theft for resources, it's continuing right now, particularly in BC. You know, everything's context specific, but in Western Canada, you know, the majority of the province's revenue is from logging, mining, and oil and gas. And so when you talk about decolonizing or this kind of, you know, anti-empire movements, like it's not going to go anywhere. It's always about land. It will always be about land. And that's the only way to rectify the errors of empire, the missteps of empire. And it's never going to happen. So unless something gets blown up and things really change, we're still in that space.
Other questions? I might just add that one thing you miss when you are really focused on boundary maintenance, rough categories, is like, I don't know, the weeds that are hybridizing on the margins that are, I don't know, the evolution, the third things that are happening, I don't know, all the interesting things that happen on the margins that often are very beautiful. And yeah.
Thank you all for your great presentations. And Jared, I thought that your framing about like schema and sort of frameworks of the mind is super helpful. But during the talks, I was thinking about, you know, how this is all being hosted by a landscape architecture department. And I was just thinking about fields, horticulture, gardening, agriculture, and just, you know, where thinking is going. So maybe there seems something very hopeful in landscape architecture, bringing together, like it changing. And last night, I think a student here was saying, what do I do next? So I think there's some deep philosophical questions about that. Like where do things go and where do people put their hopes? So trying to bring it to a more positive place because we went to a dark place.
I think we're sort of at time, so I want to say like that comment from the audience is the perfect place to end. So thank you very much, all of you.